If you've been around this little audio hobby for a little while, I'm sure you'll be well aware of the numerous collaborations that Mastrop have done with the likes of AKG, Hi-Fi-Man, Me Audio, and in the case of this review, Sennheiser. Moving on from the incredibly successful HD6XX, Mastrop have yet again managed to come up with an incredibly value-packed product, the HD58X Jubilee. There's just no mistaking the 58X for anything other than a Sennheiser designed headphone. From the mostly plastic design to the understated and minimal branding, the 58X has all the hallmarks. In fact, the whole modular design of the HD6 line has been carried over, so you could very well transplant the drivers, earpads, the headband, grills and frame from the 600, 650 or 660S onto the 58X, should you want to or even need to do so. We're also getting the same proprietary 2-pin connector for the cable that we've seen on the other Sennheiser headphones. Out of the box, the clamping force was just a little on the stiff side for my liking, but this is easily fixed by extending the headband adjustment all the way out and just ever so slightly bending the metal band. But I do mean that this has to be done really slightly, because remember that it would need to fit back into the plastic frame when retracted. After less than a week of using the 58X, they feel totally comfortable and I can wear them for hours without any sort of discomfort other than some slight heat buildup around my ears. Now, because this is a product designed in collaboration with Mastrop, there have been some corners cut here and there in the overall finishing and construction. Maybe it's on par with the design and build quality of the likes of the HD600 and 650, but I don't have either of them on hand to say for certain. But what I do have is the 660S, and the 58X does fall a bit short in both the overall design and in the quality of the construction. I still feel that the materials used and how the 660S feels in the hand still does not justify its $500 price tag, but it does still feel like a slightly better put together headphone than the 58X. In contrast, the 58X feels looser at the ear cups, which makes it a little more rattly. Couple that with the different finishes of the plastic parts and what you get is a headphone that is just overall less refined than that of the 660S. The difference can be experienced even down to the cables, where the texture of the cable used on the 660S is just ever so slightly smoother. So no, the 58X is never going to feel premium, but I wouldn't go so far as to say that it feels outright cheap and flimsy either. Adequate is the word that comes to mind, especially when taking the price tag into consideration. Okay, now if there's one thing I don't normally talk about, then it's about the robustness or the longevity of the build. How long of a delay could you expect before the effects of daily wear and tear would begin to show up? Now, I don't normally cover this simply because I never have the product for long enough to really be able to find out. So what makes the 58X any different, you might ask? Well, let me tell you a little story and then I'll show you something. If you order items from Mastrop, you've got a choice of a few different shipping options, but that's only if you're in the United States. In my case, I had to have it shipped to the United Arab Emirates, which meant that I only had a single shipping option, which is DHL Post. I immediately felt uneasy about this because my hatred for dealing with the postal services is only second to the uncomforting thought of a trip to a proctologist called Dr. Edward Scissorhands. I once had an Italian headphone manufacturer send me what was somewhat of a prototype of a premium headphone that they were busy with. But for some reason, once it arrived and had been processed on this side, the post office didn't want to deliver the item. So eventually we told them to just send it back to the origin, and it's only once it was received back in Italy that we learned of why the post office was so hesitant. When it was going through customs on this end, they pretty much completely destroyed the product. They cut open some of the foam lining in the protective case and totally dismantled one of the ear cups, and I think there might have been some damage to the driver as well. When I saw those pictures, I just couldn't believe how anyone can think that that is an appropriate way of doing their job. Because let's face it, whoever was involved there either had a level of narcissistic arrogance that simply didn't allow them to give a single damn if they damaged the product, or they entirely lacked the mental capacity to even realize what they were doing. Not to mention, the person who was involved with this Italian company had arranged for me to check out these headphones. It's someone who I had never met in person, but we became acquainted through HeadFi and are now what I consider to be pretty good friends. So when all that happened, I felt so bad that he got burnt so badly whilst trying to do a nice thing for me. Of course, I'm not responsible for any of it, but I still felt terrible. So it's safe to say that between the long delivery times and just the sheer incompetence of some employees, I try my best to just avoid the whole postal process at pretty much any cost. Okay, right, so back to the 58X. I think it was just one day after I placed the order with Massdrop that they were shipped out, and I was checking on the tracking info every few hours. One of the tracking updates had me a little worried, because it said the slightly damaged shipment is being repackaged. Now, I'm a person who pays close attention to words. I listen to not just what someone says or writes, but how they say or write it. So when I read slightly damaged, I'm thinking, okay, the box might have been dinged up a bit and they're just putting it in another box to protect the item. But believe me, when I tell you that nothing, absolutely nothing, could prepare me for what I was to see at the post office when I went to collect it. That right there is the box. Or rather, what's left of it anyways. Believe it or not, when this package showed up at my local post office, it was soaking wet. There was a point in time that I felt my heart sink and I had basically made up my mind that there was just no way that I'll be going home with my 58X today. I was simply going to refuse delivery of the item. It must have happened somewhere between when I first saw the state of the box and when the postal worker handed me a piece of paper to sign, which essentially absolves them of any responsibility. Now, in the spirit of fairness, I should add that it was obvious to me that this issue had nothing to do with the UAE Postal Service because the DHL update was posted whilst the package was still in Germany. So it either happened there or before it got to Germany. But I really wanted the 58X, so I said I'm not signing anything until I get to inspect it. At first they were reluctant, but eventually they agreed. So at this point I still couldn't quite grasp what that poor box had to go through. But as I worked my way through that papier-mâché mess, I couldn't believe what I was seeing when I finally laid my eyes on these headphones. Not only did they seem totally unharmed, but as if by some miracle, they were bone dry. How on earth is this even possible? I felt the earpads and the headband over and over again, and there was just not even the slightest hint of any moisture whatsoever. But then another thing struck me. Part of the product's packaging is, of course, to make it look more appealing. But the main task is to protect it throughout the entire journey from the factory and into your home. Sadly for this poor headphone, the packaging had zero structural integrity left, and so it could obviously not provide the level of protection that it was intended for. And yet, the 58X got to me completely unharmed. There were no dents, no cracks, no warps, not even a slight scratch. So I think it's safe to say that this particular headphone survived far more abuse in the span of 2 weeks than what I would throw at it over the course of several years. And maybe, just maybe, the silver lining to this entire ordeal serves only as a testament to the robustness of these headphones. To say that I was impressed by this is putting it mildly, to say the least. But the pleasant surprises didn't stop there, because the first thing I did after having removed the headphones from the remnants of the packaging was to plug it into my phone to double check that there was no damage to the drivers. There was none, but what there was a smile on my face and an overwhelming sense of relief. I signed the silly piece of paper that they handed to me, paid the import duty, and hurried back to my car, where I sat for about another 10 minutes just listening to the 58X. I was still trying to recover from the horror of seeing that packaging, but man, did the sound of these headphones make it awfully easy to forget. So I got home and spent at least 4 hours straight listening to them. Okay, there might have been a bathroom break here and there, maybe a little pause to adjust the clamping force, but other than that, I just found myself thoroughly enjoying these headphones. Do they sound perfect? Well, no. There is some lack in refinement here and there, but there was absolutely nothing I heard that didn't make me enjoy any single piece of music I was throwing at it. If we take a look at the frequency response graph, we can see that the 58X offers an overall very balanced sound signature. It's got a warmer sound character and a bass response that digs in very deep, down to 12 Hz in fact. But the bass isn't bloated as to muddy up the mid-range. It's there when it needs to be, and it's there to support the mids, not dominate them. There's only one aspect that I would consider a slight flaw, and that's a slight peak at around the 5 kHz mark. Some users have reported that the 58X can sometimes sound a little grainy to them, and I think it's this 5 kHz peak that's responsible for it. But it's not something that I'm constantly hearing, and so I don't feel bothered by it. If there's one specific characteristic that I would pick out about the 58X, then it would be how captivating they can make electric guitars sound. Perhaps it's just that slight graininess, but that raw crunch and that bite of rock guitars is something that is portrayed so well. In fact, these headphones reignited my enjoyment for listening to the Dire Straits and ZZ Top. Those iconic riffs in Money for Nothing and La Grange just sounds so addictive. In typical fashion of the HD6 line, we don't exactly get a very wide sound stage. It does seem out of my head, but definitely not as wide as something from the AKG K7 line. As we look towards the rest of the upper registers, we can see that there are no sibilance-inducing peaks at around the 8 kHz mark, and generally things seem very well behaved. There is a bit of a dip at the 14 kHz point, and for me personally, I do wish the dip wasn't quite as deep, as it does reduce that wonderful shimmery effect of cymbals. I think that, along with just a bit more elevation at around the 10 kHz mark, would have helped to extract some finer treble details and would have likely also increased the perceived width of the stereo image. But looking at the graph as a whole, I really can't complain about much. And it's in looking at this graph that I'm seeing a pattern that is carried over from the overall build quality and design. The 58X simply lacks some minor refinement, especially when compared to Sennheiser's official products. And that brings me to how the sound of the 58X compares to that of the 660S. Now, there has been a lot of talk about how the 58X may or may not be using the same drivers as the 660S or perhaps even the HD700. But whatever the case is, if we compare the frequency response of the 58X to that of the 660S, we can see some very strong similarities indeed. If we look specifically at the 5 kHz peak, we'll see that the 660S doesn't have as sharp of a peak, and this comes across when listening to the 660S too. The treble region just sounds a bit smoother and more refined on the 660S. And there's that word again, refined. When I reviewed the 660S, I was loaned an HD650 for the purpose of comparing the sound, and I did find myself enjoying the overall sound character of the 650 more. That warmer signature just added enough flavor for me to keep listening for longer. And maybe this is the thing that I like most about the 58X. For me, it sits squarely in between the 650 and the 660S. It's got the warmer and overall more easygoing character of the 650, while still incorporating a little more of the treble response of the 660S. It's not what I would necessarily describe as a best of both worlds scenario, but a very enjoyable compromise between those two signatures nonetheless. So much so that if you said to me there are no price tags attached, pick one. Honestly, I'd pick the 58X. I think at this point it should already be pretty clear to you where I stand in terms of the value of the 58X. This is, hands down, by far, without the faintest shadow of a doubt, the best sounding headphones I've tried at around the $150 mark. Hell, they might even be my favorite at double that price. And I certainly have heard headphones that cost considerably more, and yet I didn't find nearly as enjoyable. Is it perfect? Of course not. But at $150, I don't think it would be fair to expect perfection, would you? The fact of the matter is that when I glance over to the 660S, I just don't get it. What is Sennheiser's game plan here? The sound quality of the 58X could easily be sold for $300, but instead they're being sold for half that. What's more, it costs less than a third of what the 660S is being sold for. So again, what's the deal here? Well, whatever is going on, all I can say is that the 58X is an absolute bargain. Given the outright bang for buck value, I would subjectively score the HD58X a perfect 10 out of 10. But of course, scoring it objectively will result in something a little different, so it will lose a few points here and there for a lack of additional accessories and the lack in refinement of the build quality. Nevertheless, if you're someone who wants to spend no more than about $150 on a pair of headphones that sound great, are tough as nails, and are perfectly suitable to a wide range of music genres, then this little gem that is the 58X Jubilee gets my highest recommendation. Well, that's it for this review. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, if you've got any questions or comments, please do leave them down below. That's all from me for now, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers!